Welcome back to the Caribbean. Today we'll be talking about historical geography and population in the Caribbean. All right, so today we're covering historical geography. And this right here is a picture I took at the Greenwich Museum of Maritime History, where they captured slave ships. And it shows basically diagrams of the slave ship and the different levels and how people were packed into these ships for their voyage across. And we'll talk more about that coming up, but it is something that's very moving when you take a look at something like this, when you actually see how people were packed in during the slave trade. Now, before we get to that, we want to talk about pre-Columbian Caribbean. That's before the Europeans came across. There was up to maybe 6 million people that lived in the Caribbean islands. And the first group is the Guanahata Bays. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, so I'll try not to do it too much. They're also called the Siboney. So you hear both names, the Siboney, and this is the first group. No one knows where they came from, where they came from Florida and came across, or they came up from South America and island hopped. But these are hunters and gatherers that lived in caves and small communities. And when the Spanish came across, they learned about them from the Taino people that they met, which we'll talk about in the next slide. And they just told them who these people were. And basically, the Tainos were coming up and pushing out the Guanahata Bays or the Siboney and assimilating them or pushing them out. So they were just living on that kind of far western edge of Cuba. The Tainos, they come from the Arawak cultural group that comes from South America, from the Amazon basin. And they eventually made their way up and they took over the Caribbean islands. And there's different groups. They talk about the Eastern, Western, and classical Tainos, but basically we'll just call them the Tainos. And this was a sedentary group. They had villages with up to 4,000 people. They did fishing and hunting and gathering, but they also had their own farms. And this is the group that Christopher Columbus stumbled upon when he came across into the Bahamas on his first trip. The third group that came up are the island Caribs, and they call themselves the Kalinagos. Again, names changed. They were called the Caribs by the Spanish, but they can consider themselves the Kalinagos. And they still exist to this day. They were a very fierce group. They had huge war canoes, and they fought off anybody that came across them. They were making their way also from South America, and they were going up the islands, and they were pushing the Tainos out. Now, the Caribbean Sea is actually called that because of the Caribs, and it's supposed to mean cannibal sea because during their conquest of other groups, they would do ritual eating of, for example, people's hearts. So that's where you get the idea of cannibals. Although that's really just a ritualistic thing, and they weren't really cannibals. But that's where the Caribbean Sea was named after, was cannibals. But they are called the Kalinagos. And as I mentioned, most of the Tainos disappeared very quickly after the Spanish came. They were enslaved. They were put into the mines. There was warfare. There was disease. All of those things contributed to pretty much the desiccation of the Taino peoples. The Caribs did suffer the same thing, but they still exist. And there are communities across the Caribbean islands, the Lesser Antilles, even Trinidad and Tobago, where you have these fishing communities that are descendants of the Kalinagos. And they were so fierce that even into the late 1700s, they were fighting off the British, and the British had to sign peace treaties with those groups. But eventually they were assimilated into other groups that were brought across. Of course, the European conquest, as I just mentioned, this is Christopher Columbus's 4 voyages to the Americas. He ran into the Tainos, that was his first group up in the Bahamas, but he did experience the Caribs and others. And here's a quote from Christopher Columbus. And I know it's a long quote. I'll just go ahead and read it. You can read with me. They traded with us and gave us everything they had with goodwill. They took great delight in pleasing us. They are very gentle and without knowledge of what is evil, nor do they murder or steal. Your Highness may believe that in all the world there can be no better people. They love their neighbors as themselves, and they have the sweetest talk in the world and are gentle and always laughing. And after that nice introduction to the King of Spain, the Spanish enslaved the Taino people in what was called the encomiendo system, which is meant to entrust people. And so they're supposed to take care of them, but it was really basically forced slavery where they had to work in mines and other things. And some of the first Spaniards did take Taino wives. And then, so we have a mix. And so even today, you can look at some of the genetic things in some of the Caribbean islands, like in Jamaica, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Hispaniola. And genetically, you can find some descendants that were people that of the Taino. So in that way, they do still exist, but mostly they were completely wiped out. Here's an example. On Hispaniola, before contact, there was almost 4 million Taino people. By 20 years later, 15 years later, there was only 60,000. That's how quickly that population was decimated. In Puerto Rico, 600,000 to none. Jamaica, 600,000 to maybe 74 with the census in 1611. And again, that was due to disease, warfare, and enslavement. The end result of this was that the Caribbean's physical, we've talked about that in the previous class, and the cultural geographies were completely reworked by the conquest. And then today, that's created a hybrid of European, African, Asian, which we'll talk about later, and indigenous cultures. Now, here's a Karl Marx quote that I really like. And I'll try to keep it brief and not go too much detail about this. But the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment into mines of the Aboriginal populations, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of blackskins, signalizing slavery, that signalized the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. These idyllic proceedings are the chief momenta of primitive accumulation. And the idea here is that the idea of primitive accumulation means that some people have the means of production of how you make your living, so that you own your land and you can grow crops and live off of that. But when that's taken away from you, then somebody accumulates that, and then you become a worker. And so that's kind of the beginning of capitalist production. And the Caribbean is one of the first places where that really arose and really provided the impetus for the rise of capitalist production. And the Caribbean is one of the first places that had that. And that's why it's kind of the first one with, in terms of globalization. Now, on a different topic, the Spanish focused their things on the Greater Antilles. There was more indigenous people to enslave, and there was gold and silver, and it didn't last very long. They kind of ran out very quickly, and they moved to the mainland, to Middle America and South America. The Lesser Antilles were left alone for the most part. So Hispaniola, the big island with Haiti and the Dominican Republic, was one of the areas. The oldest establishment or settlement in the Americas is actually in the Dominican Republic. But Haiti was lost to the French in the 1600s. They also had Puerto Rico and Cuba, and then Jamaica, but that was lost to the British in the 1600s, as we talked in the previous class, where they used that for the British, as well as the French and Haiti, used that for bases for them to go and rob the Spanish galleons, which had gold and silver coming from the Americas, and they tried to rob them. And that's the Pirates of the Caribbean that you'd think of. Now, the Lesser Antilles, those smaller islands, they were ignored for the most part by the Spanish, but the French and English in the 1620s on started focus on there, and later the Netherlands and Denmark acquired colonies as well. And these were colonies based on plantation agriculture that we'll talk about later in terms of bringing slaves and other groups over to work for sugarcane especially. and creating wealth for the European countries. Now, this one looks a little bit busy, but basically it's just showing how many times and how these small islands were fought over by the French and the British and the Dutch. And you can see how many times they changed hands. So this one was, the Dutch, then the British, then the Dutch, British, Dutch, French, Dutch, British ended up being Dutch. So all these places were fought over small little specks on the map, but they held so much wealth in terms of their ways to grow sugarcane that all these European countries went ahead and fought for them. And that's what leads to plantation societies. So in the 1640s, the Dutch were in Brazil, but they were forced out by the Portuguese, and they brought their technologies about sugarcane production and processing to the Caribbean, starting in Barbados. And it didn't take very long where Barbados, Jamaica, and Haiti become the richest colonies in the world. France gave up most of Canada just for Haiti because of how much value that the sugarcane and the sugar brought to those countries. And that leads to the triangular trade. You probably heard about this, where you bring slaves from Africa to the Caribbean and, you know, the Caribbean and Americas. You bring sugarcane and tobacco and other things that they produce back to Europe, and then they bring manufactured goods back to Africa. But it's a much more complex trade than just three ties. So you can see that from Europe, they brought down things like guns and cloth and iron and other things, and down to West Africa, and they supplied the kingdoms that were there. They didn't actually control those areas. They worked with the kingdoms, the powerful kingdoms in West Africa, and that provided them more power because they had things like guns, right? And they would go into the interior and dominate their enemies, if you will, and then bring them back as slaves and trade that for those goods. They would then come across to the Caribbean, and in the Caribbean, they would then bring slaves over and they would produce things like sugarcane, molasses, etc. And a lot of that would then come up into North America, especially the Northeast. Boston became the rum producer of the world. They took that molasses, turned it into rum, and then they would pick up other things and bring it back to Europe. And so we had this triangular trade, but it was very much more complex than people actually think. Now, in terms of population, the native groups were widely decimated, as we saw. So they started with first with indentured servants coming from Ireland and Scotland, for example, into the Caribbean. And they were supposed to work on these sugarcane plantations. That didn't last very long. But interestingly, the first rum, you might know what rum is, that's coming from distillation of sugar. And people from Ireland and Scotland are good at distilling, for example, whiskeys. And those are the people that actually came to the Caribbean and they found something they could distill, and that's where rum started. The oldest rum estate is actually in Barbados in the Caribbean, and from that point on, that's where rum started from, was bringing over indentured servants from Ireland and Scotland. But that didn't last too long, so then they quickly changed to African slaves, and the slave trade began. And it began actually in the 1500s, but it continued and expanded, especially in the 16 and 1700s. Now, in the 1830s, slavery ended for the British Empire, a little bit later for the French and others. So instead of bringing over slaves from Africa, now they turned to bring, because they still needed workers on the plantations. So the British brought over indentured servants, not technically slaves, from India. That was part of their empire. In the Dutch islands, they brought over indentured servants from Indonesia, and that influenced the bringing in of different groups into some of the areas when slavery ended. And that creates that kind of the milieu of cultures that we see in the Caribbean. And in Cuba, they brought over Chinese indentured servants. So now we have all these different continents and these different places from South, East, and Southeast Asia being brought to the Caribbean on top of the African populations that were brought earlier during slavery. Now, looking at the slave trade, about 12 million people is estimated have come across to the Americas. And you can see Brazil received the most, but the Caribbean received as a total about the same amount on these small islands. And then also into British colonial America. And then once we became the US, we also brought in slaves too for a while. And that had a decimating effect on the populations in Africa, the amount of people that came. It's estimated that 30 million people were enslaved. About half made it to the coast, and then about half made it across, which means about 12 million people were made the journey across in horrible conditions. So based on those different groups, we have people from Africa, from India, from China, from Southeast Asia, and all those places. That's created a very interesting cultural mix of people, as well as Europeans, in the Caribbean. So right here, taking a look at the contemporary population of the Caribbean, this is people per square kilometer. You can see how high it is. So the islands are pretty densely populated. Here's some numbers. Looking at Haiti and the population growth rates, it's about 1.6. You can see that Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Jamaica have moderate growth rates. They're not actually that high in terms of growth rates. Um, Puerto Rico and Cuba have very low natural increase rates, much lower than the US. But the population density, the people per square kilometer on the far right of this graph, you can see they're very, very high. In the US, it's 37 people per square kilometer. And in Haiti, it's 353. So very densely populated. And looking at population pyramids for Haiti in 2022, so just, in the last year, it's the most recent data that we have, they were growing very fast. When you see that population pyramid looking like a pyramid, that's growing very fast. But looking about, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it's slowed down. And Haiti's getting very slow growth now. That's something very different when I taught this class in the past. 20 years ago. So you can see how it's flattening out on both edges. That means that they're not having as many children and it's getting very slow growth. Families are not having as many children. In Jamaica, we see the same thing and is almost getting inverted and it's getting close. So on average, people are having like one and a half, families are having one and a half children. That's not enough to replace the mother and father. And so they're coming very close to having negative growth. And Cuba has gone there as well. They were exploding, about 60 years ago. And then they had the revolution, things went in, and then it's really stagnated. So you see that on both sides, the left and the right. It's really becoming flatlined, and that means low population growth and getting close to negative growth. Now, going to some other places in the Caribbean that have low growth, a place like the Bahamas, they have a low population density because they have so many islands. But St. Lucia, Trinidad, they have high densities, but low growth. And then you look at Barbados with very low growth, but look at the population density. Like I said, it's 667 people per square kilometer. In the US, it's only 37. So Barbados is one of the, in the Caribbean, has the highest population densities. So here's Barbados. You can see they're getting close to negative growth. Once you see that inverted pyramid, it means that they're not having enough children to replace themselves. Now, another thing that really drives population growth, because we have to add this in, is not just births and deaths, it's also migration, people leaving or coming into a country. And the Caribbean has always been a place that has sent people to other parts of the world. So that's been a safety valve when their population grows for high. And you can see quite a few of them, especially the ones that are close to the US, coming to the United States. So Belize, Cuba, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Jamaica, and Puerto Rico, which is part of the US. So that's kind of a misnomer. And then you see also groups from the Leeward Islands. These are French, British, and Dutch islands. They tend to actually go toward Europe and going to the mother countries, whether it's England, France, or the Netherlands. And that's really a relation to, in terms of their historical, with the colonialism that they had. Who are the colonial powers? But there is this sort of geographic proximity for some of the larger ones coming to the US, but for the smaller ones, they end up going more to Europe. Okay, I'm going to stop on this section before we move to social conditions in the Caribbean. And yes, and we'll see if I have another video for you. I'm not sure if you guys like those or not.